As you heard on Bridge City News, Daniel Smith and the UCP won another majority, but ended up losing some seats in the process. Now, to chat about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, it was a late night for so many of us as the results slowly trickled in from Elections Alberta. Were you kind of surprised by the results? I mean, the 2019 election saw the UCP win 63 seats, and that number has dwindled down considerably, but still majority territory.
Yeah, I think it was a reasonable conclusion that the UCP were probably going to get a majority. But the surprise, I think, was just how slim that majority is. Now, they have 49 seats, the NDP has 38 seats. So that's an 11-seat spread. But what sort of matters here is that 44 seats is the majority. So that gives them, sort of a handful of people to play with. And of course, Jennifer Johnson, the Lacombe-Panoka candidate, has been told she won't be in caucus, and they need to select a speaker. So that's basically a three-person majority at the end of the day, which is a very slender majority, the tightest, smallest majority, I think, ever in an Alberta provincial election.
Now, this is the second straight defeat for NDP leader Rachel Notley. Tyler, will she be sticking around as party leader? What are your thoughts?
She says she will. In her concession speech on Monday night, she said that it would be sort of her honor to continue in the role of official opposition and leader of the New Democrats. You do have to wonder if she's going to stick around for the next election. She's now actually the longest serving MLA, first elected in 2008 in her riding of Edmonton Strathcona. And so you do have to wonder, does she have another election in her? I guess the other question is, do the New Democrats have an obvious heir apparent, someone who could step into her shoes? I think much of the NDP brand is also the Rachel Notley brand. You almost have sort of a Jack Layton federal NDP thing going on here. It's kind of hard, honestly, for me anyways, to imagine a different leader taking over that party. But she's going to be leader for the foreseeable future, whether she runs in the next election, I think at this point would just be guesswork.
Tyler, actually, some people were talking about NDP Lethbridge West candidate Shanna Phillips, who was re-elected, may be the heir apparent to Rachel Notley. So we'll actually see what happens there. Now, where did the NDP go wrong? Was it the talk of raising the corporate income tax from 8 to 11%? Was that enough to maybe scare many Alberta voters?
I think that's one possibility. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion in the next couple of days about why the NDP couldn't quite bring it over the finish line. I think that the corporate tax hike is probably part of the story. I think almost certainly the debate is part of the story. Danielle Smith almost certainly overperformed in that debate. She was very, very disciplined, very on message, did not have any sort of remarks that might have raised some eyebrows. So that's a possible turning point, a possible misstep on the part of the NDP, Rachel Notley not coming off stronger in that debate. But, broadly speaking, I don't think either campaign really had any massive mistakes. This was it's a very boring election in some ways. There was not a big issue. There was not all that much drama. There was not any sort of big issue that came out of nowhere, any gaffe, so kind of a strange election, but you do have to just think that, whatever Rachel Notley and the NDP did, it wasn't quite enough to persuade more former UCP voters to come over to them. And I think they have to ask themselves the question of why.
So outside of the debate, what did Daniel Smith and the UCP really do right this election? Was it maybe focusing on jobs and the economy?
My suspicion is that it was focusing on Rachel Notley's record when she was in government from 2015 to 2019, and that's sort of inextricably bound with jobs in the economy, because of course those years were not very good economic years. And there's also, a fair bit of debate over to what extent that was Rachel Notley's fault or not. But when they're able to say, look, do you want to go back to those years if we reelect Rachel Notley? That's a pretty potent message to Albertans who are, have emerged from the pandemic, who dealt with several years of economic downturn. So yeah, I do think that the jobs and economy stuff was a major success for the UCP. I don't think they were as effective as Jason Kenney was in 2019 when he was sort of jobs economy pipeline. That just completely overwhelmed the election, and there was space for other issues, but the NDP sort of failed to make this election about, for example, healthcare, which was something they certainly wanted to talk about. And the UCP was quite effective at saying, look at Rachel Notley's economic record. This is what we are doing. Do you want to continue the path we are on economically. So I think they did a really good job on that.
Now, Tyler, some high-profile names for the UCP lost their seats, including Jason Copping and Casey Madu. What happened there?
Well, Casey Madu, who was the deputy premier under Danielle Smith and justice minister under Jason Kenney, held the lone UCP seat in sort of Edmonton proper. So he got skunked, the NDP took all 20 seats in sort of actual Edmonton. There's some UCP seats still in the so-called donut ridings around the city, but that was just very clearly a factor in Edmonton pivoting to the NDP. And of course, Casey Madu had his own sort of scandal during the Kenney years when he contacted the Edmonton police chief over a ticket he received. So that may have played a factor as well. And Jason Copping was the labor minister under Kenney and health minister under Danielle Smith. I think similar thing there. There were a number of ridings in Calgary that flipped on Monday night, and he was probably caught up in that wave. I would suspect that part of the government's record on COVID-19 played into the end of the health minister. But in some ways, you can either say this person did something wrong or they goofed in some way. But there is also just the broader trends that were afoot last night, and the broader trend was the NDP making advances on the UCP, and there were a few UCP casualties in the mix.
And speaking of big names, Tyler Chandra, at this point in time, Elections Alberta is saying that he's behind in his riding right now by the very slim margin.
Oh, an astonishingly slim margin. 7 votes is what Elections Alberta is projecting. Now, there's very likely going to be a recount in that case because it is so slim. But at this hour, Tyler Chandra also looking to lose his seat. And he of course was caught up in the ethics commissioner report where Danielle Smith was criticized for contacting him about Artur Pawlowski's COVID-related cases. And he also had that altercation with a family doctor on their driveway. So Tyler Chandra had a bit of a mixed record, I think is safe to say. And again, as I just said, unclear, was it that stuff or was it just simply that the tide's turning a little bit on Monday?
Now, a number of Albertans thought this election was going to be a UCP blowout, but the pollsters really didn't buy it, and it was closer than many people realize.
And it was closer, I would say, than a good number of the pollsters predicted. The polls sort of showed a little bit of a UCP lead going into this, and that's sort of what held throughout the night. But Alberta's gone so heavily conservative so often in the past that Monday night, I think, was a little bit of a surprise for people. And, the thing that is, maybe atypical about it is there's sort of these 3 constituencies that we've talked about before, Edmonton, Calgary, and the rest of the province. And usually you win 2 out of 3 to form government. What's interesting about last night is the UCP kind of won, 1.5, and that was enough. They won half of Calgary and they won sort of rural and small town Alberta by and large. So a little bit of a twist in sort of this narrative of how Alberta elections are won as well.
Now, here in Lethbridge, UCP Lethbridge East candidate Nathan Neudorf won. He's also Smith's deputy premier and infrastructure minister. And the NDP Shanna Phillips also kept hers. I got to say, Tyler, that Lethbridge is really a city divided when it comes to politics.
It certainly sounds like it, eh? There is, from what we've talked about, there are a couple of pretty strong campaigns going on there and a very strong challenger to Shanna Phillips, and she's come out on top, and Nathan Neudorf as well. And, for Neudorf in particular, you have to wonder what role he's going to get in cabinet this time around. If we end up having Casey Madu, Tyler Chandra, and Jason Copping all out, you've lost some senior ministers there, and there's going to be some opportunity for some of the newer folks in caucus to maybe make a bit of a splash once it comes time to select cabinet.
Now that the dust is slowly settling on this provincial election, what is really next for Premier-elect Danielle Smith and her party, and what will her relationship look like with the Trudeau government moving forward?
Well, first things first is probably to figure out the cabinet question, I would imagine. I don't think we know yet whether or not there's going to be a sort of summer sitting of the legislature. It would not surprise me if they push that off till fall. But certainly we should see a cabinet announcement in the next little while to know who's going to be forming that group of people. As for the relationship with the Trudeau Liberals, well, in her victory speech on Monday night, Smith did sort of the usual victory stuff, thanked her supporters, reached out to Albertans across the aisle, and then pivoted to an attack on the Trudeau Liberals. It's interesting because that was not a big issue in this campaign. That was an issue in 2019, that Alberta alienation was at a really high level, that there was this major pushback from Albertans and from the province over Bills C-69 and C-48. That was less of a campaign issue this time. But it's obviously a big issue for UCP supporters and particularly the party membership. So it is going to be interesting to see where Danielle Smith takes that. She has the Sovereignty Act that has yet to be used. So, is that going to become an issue in play? Or is it just going to be more rhetoric, a lot of which we saw from the Kenney government before her? So, bit of an open question there, but she certainly came out on Monday night with both barrels firing.
Now, lost in all of this is the fact that the Alberta Green Party, Tyler, finished third, beating out the Alberta Party. The Greens got, I think, just over 14,000 votes, 14,085 votes, compared to 12,715 for the Alberta Party. But this was really still a two-horse race, wasn't it, between the UCP and the NDP?
Absolutely. The NDP had something like 750,000 votes and the UCP had something like 920,000 votes. So, these other parties did not make a big splash in sort of the overall scheme of things. They almost mattered in a couple places, particularly Banff, Kananaskis, where, again, a very, very thin margin between the UCP and the NDP. And if you look at the numbers, the Green Party took a good but small, portion of those numbers, which certainly had the New Democrats on the edge of their seats on Monday. But someone's going to have to write an obituary for the Alberta Liberal Party and possibly the Alberta Party as well.
What about some of these independent parties as well that talk about sovereignty and they want to separate from the rest of Canada? Mm-hmm. We saw a number of them as well. Is this just vanity projects for a lot of the leaders of these particular parties? Or, they're very passionate about what they believe in and their agenda.
These parties have sort of always existed, I would say. There has been independence-related movements in Alberta for a long, long time. The Solidarity movement, Artur Pawlowski's group picked up, I think, around 12,000 votes maybe. Which again, some of those might have played a little bit of a role in Calgary because those margins were razor thin in some of those ridings that the NDP won and some of those ridings that the UCP won. So I think there's going to be a little more analysis to be done on just how much those parties mattered. But we are certainly not talking on either the right or the left like the vote splitting we had in the past. The right split the vote in 2015, and the left had a little bit of a split vote in 2019. So those parties, I think, will continue to exist. I think pretty much everyone agrees that it's good to have alternate options where people can really, vote with their heart as opposed to voting for the lesser of two evils, for example. But, unless something really changes in the next few years, it's pretty hard to imagine there even being a third party in the legislature at any time soon.
Could you imagine if Artur Pawlowski would have won a seat? The fireworks at the legislature, hitting Danielle Smith and Rachel Notley with both barrels.
It would have been a show to see, that's for sure.
Do you think that Calgary will finally get their sports and entertainment complex in the new arena now that the UCP has been reelected?
Yeah, probably. That was a weird one, right? Because Danielle Smith announced it either right before the campaign started or right after. And she kind of said, we're going to announce this, but we're going to leave it until we form government to get the deal done. So maybe the good money is on, yes, they'll get it done. But of course, the deal has fallen apart at least once, possibly more than that before. So it's one of those things where until the ink's dry, maybe don't bet on it.
Tyler Dawson's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post. Thanks for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks so much, Hal.